So last chapter is the extreme opposite of a perfectly competitive market, a monopoly. All right, so monopoly means no competition. It means that if you're producing the good, you are the only one producing the good, and it has to be that there's no really close substitutes for the consumers to choose from. So if the consumers want to buy the good, they have to buy it from you. Now, for the consumers, that sucks. But for the producer, that's great. And it's great because if you want to raise the price a little bit, you can do that. Now, if you do raise the price a little bit, the consumers will buy less, right? The law of demand still applies. If you raise the price, they'll buy less, but you can do it. And if it raises your profits, you will want to do it. Okay, so a monopolist will charge higher prices, and then the result is that the consumers will get a smaller quantity compared to a perfectly competitive market. So perfect competition, great for the consumer, but perfect competition was not great for the producer because in the long run, the economic profit was zero, so they didn't make much money. But for a monopolist, they will be able to earn a profit for as long as they can be a monopoly, right? So in perfect competition, we saw that the firms could earn a profit in the short run, but then other firms would enter the market and start selling the good, and the price would go down and the profits would disappear. But a monopolist is a monopolist, right? Nobody else will be able to enter the market and start producing the good, as long as there's something, anyway, that prevents other firms from entering the market and selling the same good. Good. Okay, so lots of examples. So first one, athletes. Now, I think it was last class I talked a little bit about labor markets, and I explained that, you know, if you just have a high school degree, you're kind of part of a perfectly competitive labor market because there's a lot of people with high school degrees, and so it's very hard to get a job, and you definitely can't demand higher wages. You're basically a price taker. You take whatever wage is being offered to you. But if you have a special talent, you have a monopoly over yourself, and if you have a special talent that other people don't have, then you're like a monopolist, and you can demand higher prices, right? So the Sedin twins there, obviously they were very good hockey players. You know, if you're someone like Kim Kardashian, right, you can demand high prices for whatever it is you do, because there's only one of you, right? Okay, so people have monopolies over themselves, which is only meaningful if you have a special talent. Diamonds. Okay, so diamonds are expensive, not just because they're rare, but also because the market is not competitive. And it was run by a monopoly. It was run by one firm starting a long time ago, and this firm still has a lot of market share. I'll get you guys in the back to please be a little bit quieter. Good. Okay. If you invent something, so like writing books or songs or inventing a pharmaceutical formula for a drug, then you have monopoly power for a certain amount of time. Governments sometimes have monopolies on certain kinds of markets. Now, this is an example from China from a long time ago, right? Like not now, but a long time ago they had a monopoly over salt. Canada, we had, say, the trading companies, right? Like Hudson's Bay Company, and you know, and they had monopolies because they had control over a certain territory in the continent. Okay, so lots of examples of monopolies. Now, difference. Difference is that they don't have to take the market prices given. They are the market. All right. As opposed to last chapter, chapter 12, perfectly competitive markets. Each firm is selling exactly the same good, and so in a perfectly competitive market, you have to be a price taker. You cannot try to charge a higher price or you just won't be able to sell anything. Okay, so producers in a perfectly competitive market are price takers because if they're all selling the same thing and one of them tries to charge a higher price compared to all the others, the consumers will just not buy anything from that one firm. The consumers have the same good available from many, many other firms. So the consumers would just go to the other firms to buy the good. But when you have a monopoly over something, it means that the consumer can't go to somebody else to buy the good. If the consumer wants the good, they have to buy it from you. So you have what's called market power then. You have the ability to raise prices. And therefore, you can figure out exactly what price to set to maximize your profits. Okay, so you have market power and you are a price setter. Okay. All right, so when we draw the diagram, there will be a difference in how we draw the demand curve. So in chapter 12, for an individual firm, we drew the demand curve as perfectly elastic because the price would be constant no matter what quantity they produced. And if a firm tried to raise the price, then the consumers would just not buy the good anymore. But for a monopolist, they can raise the price. And the consumers will buy less, but they will still buy the good. And so therefore, we have to draw the demand curve as downward sloping so that we can show that when the price goes up, they buy less, but they do buy the good still. Okay. So consumers will pay a higher price if the quantity is smaller. All right, so for perfect competition, demand was perfectly elastic. Consumers would buy the good at this price and only this price. If the firm tried to charge a higher price, then consumers would buy nothing. Whereas if you are a monopolist, then the consumers have no option, so demand is not perfectly elastic. And so then you can raise the price. They will buy less, but you can raise the price. All right, now, to be a monopolist, though, there has to be something that is preventing competition. So something that is preventing competition is called a barrier to entry. In perfectly competitive markets, there was what we called free entry, which meant that in a perfectly competitive market, it was very easy, very low cost for somebody to enter the market, and therefore easy for competition to enter the market. But with a monopoly, there is no competition, so that means there has to be something preventing other firms from selling the good. So you have to have control over something. So say we talked about blueberries as a perfectly competitive market because it's very easy for anybody to go and get a blueberry bush and grow blueberries and sell them if they really want to. But if you had, say, a blueberry bush that had some sort of genetic mutation and it was making pink berries instead, and it was the only bush in the whole world that made pink blueberries, and it was your bush, then you would have monopoly over that because nobody else would have the same bush. Okay. All right, so there has to be barriers to entry, otherwise other firms would enter the market. Okay, so otherwise other firms would be attracted to the market. All right. So let's go through some examples of these barriers to entry. So first one is control of a scarce resource or input. All right, so diamonds are an example of that, right? The company De Beers just owned most of the diamond mines. Pharmaceutical companies and their drug formulas. So if you invent a new drug, then you have monopoly power for a certain time, right, according to the patent laws. And so, for example, something like acetaminophen. Now, acetaminophen, the original company that made it called it Tylenol. And now that was a long time ago now, so the patent is up. And so now then they had to make that drug formula like public knowledge so that other firms could make the same drug, acetaminophen. And so now you can buy the store brand acetaminophen and it's exactly the same thing. Anyway, so they no longer have a monopoly power over Tylenol, but they did for a while. Okay, next example is economies of scale. Kind of. Now, to be a monopoly, you have to have the whole market. Yeah, but if you have like a large market share, then it would be a different kind of market. So if you go on in economics, you'll learn there's other types of markets, like say a duopoly is when two firms share the market, or oligopoly, I think, is when there's just a few of them. Yeah. All right. Now oh, yeah.
Sorry, I was talking to him, but
oh, okay.
Then how is De Beers a monopoly if you just said that it has to have 100%?
Oh, they're not a monopoly anymore. They were like back in the 1800s.
But even like the 1800s, you said over 90%. Do they have to have 100% to become?
Oh, I see. Oh.
That's what I mean.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know. I guess they were pretty much a monopoly. It was very close, but not quite. You're right. Yeah. The examples we'll talk about, though, later in the notes will be just one firm. Yeah.
Is ICBC a monopoly?
Yes. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Is it? No. Can you get car insurance? Can you get a full amount of car insurance for somebody else?
You
or only part?
You have to get your basic through ICBC.
That's right. So they do. That's right. It is a monopoly for the basic insurance. That's right. Yeah.
So you have to at least have some coverage from them. So.
That's right. Yeah. So that's a monopoly.
Liquor's a
so could a contract be?
Liquor's a monopoly here as well.
That's right. The government has control over liquor sales. That's right. Yeah.
I thought liquor stores were a quota rent right there because you have to have a license to sell.
But all liquor comes from the government.
Yeah, they control the supply.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so governments will have monopolies over certain things if they feel it's better somehow. So I don't know about having a monopoly over car insurance. I don't know if it makes the market more efficient. It doesn't seem like it.
The exact quote from them in the last election was that ICBC is a dumpster fire. So.
Yeah, so it's not working out right now. Yeah, maybe the original intent was to make the market more efficient, but it's not working. Yeah.
How he said that you have to have your basic insurance through ICBC, right? So would a barrier of entry also be a contract?
Oh, kind of like if the government owns it and operates it.
Like, you know, how you have to have.
That's right, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so the next one, firms with very large fixed costs. The best example of this would be the transit system. Right? The transit system is a monopoly. But it kind of makes sense for it to be a monopoly because it's so expensive to, say, build the SkyTrain system, right? So SkyTrain for sure. It's so expensive to build the SkyTrain system that it just makes sense for one firm to do it rather than having several firms each building their own set of SkyTrain routes. It would be way more expensive if that were the case. And so it's less costly to have one firm invest in the infrastructure and then supply the entire market. Okay, And so that's because if it's just one firm paying this large amount of fixed cost, then the average fixed cost can be lower, and then the average total cost can be lower because they get to spread out that fixed cost. Okay, so that's the term spreading effect. That was from chapter 11. That was just the idea that spreading, if you're able to spread out your fixed cost over a large quantity, then it will bring your average costs down. Okay, so these monopolies like transit, SkyTrain, the ferry system, electricity companies, these are called natural monopolies because it just makes sense for them to be a monopoly. It is less costly to have one firm supplying the market. Okay, so these are natural monopolies. And so as the quantity increases, then the average total cost will be smaller. And so then that is good for the consumers as well, because it means that the prices can also be lower as the firm produces more and more output. Okay. Okay, so it will cost less for one firm to supply the market. It will cost less for one firm to supply the market. All right, so when a firm has economies of scale, then the average total cost curve will just decrease. Like rather than being a U shape, it will just decrease. Okay, so suppose that the consumers want 20 units of the good. So you could have one firm producing all 20 units of the good. Average total cost would be 5. And so then, average total cost would be 5. And so then total cost would be $100. Okay, so if one firm produced all 20 units, the total cost would be $100. Whereas if you had two firms and each of them produced half, so each of them produced 10, you're going to have a much higher cost. Because two firms, and they would each have a total cost of 12 times 10. So for each of them would be $120, and then there's two of them, so that would be a total of $240. So we'll come back to this kind of a monopoly at the end of the chapter, because this is the kind of monopoly where it makes sense to have a monopoly, but if the government does not interfere at all, then the monopoly will be a monopoly and charge high prices and have small quantities. So with these kinds of monopolies, usually the governments will try to regulate them somehow. So like with TransLink, they're not allowed to charge whatever price they want, right? And same with BC Hydro, right? They're not allowed to just charge whatever price they want. They have to go through the government when they're determining their price. And so the government does not let them charge a super high price. The government pushes the price down for them. Anyway, so we'll talk about those later in the chapter. All right, so we're still talking about examples of barriers to entry. So the third one has to do with technology. So technological superiority, and another thing called network externalities. Okay, so first, technological superiority. That one's just like say when firms develop some new good. And at first, they're the ones the only ones with that good. And then other competitors have to figure out how to make the good. And so the monopoly won't last for very long, but it will last for some time. So say smartphones, right? The first one was iPhone, right? And for a long time, if you wanted a smartphone, really the iPhone was your only option, right? Or something like GoPro. Right? And so over time, other competitors will develop similar goods, but it takes some time. And so the firm who first develops it will have kind of monopoly power for a while. Yeah?
Since we said that the lowest point on the average total curve, the average total cost curve would be the break-even point, is that only for perfectly competitive?
That's right. Yeah. So we won't really be talking about the break-even price so much in this chapter because the monopolist will be able to earn profit. So they'll charge a higher price. Yeah. Okay, and then network externalities. This is more to do with software. So this is when everybody uses a certain kind of software, for example, mostly because everyone else is using that software, right? So we all have these programs on our computers because everyone else does, right? It's not because they're the best ones. We just get them automatically because everyone else has them. And if you want to work with other people, you have to have the same programs. Or another example is, say, Facebook. Right? If you want to, well, I mean, now there's other options for social media, but first it was just Facebook, right? And so then if you wanted to interact with other people on social media, you had to go through Facebook. So they had kind of monopoly power. Well, they still kind of do. All right. Okay, last one. Last one is patents and copyrights. And so this would be government-created barriers. Oh, there's other examples, though, too. So government-created barriers. So I put patents and copyrights there. Now, patents and copyrights give the creator monopoly power for a certain amount of time. And when the creator has monopoly power, then they will charge higher prices for their good. Right? But the reason why they're there is to give incentive for creation. Right? So I was just listening to a discussion about pharmaceutical companies yesterday on the radio. And I'm sure you guys are well aware, pharmaceutical companies try to maximize profit. So they do research, they try and come up with new drugs to sell, and then at first they will be the only ones who are able to sell that drug, and so they will charge higher prices. And it's problematic, and the one thing they were talking about on the radio yesterday was to do with superbugs. You guys know superbugs, that the strains of bacteria that are really resistant to normal antibiotics. And so they were talking about how pharmaceutical companies, they have the ability to come up with drugs to fight the superbugs. But the problem is that they have to spend so much money doing the research, like billions of dollars doing the research, that then in the end they have to charge very high prices in order to cover the cost. And those drugs that could possibly fight the superbugs will cost like $4,000 or $5,000 per dose. And so, of course, most healthcare regions or the hospitals, they just can't pay for that. And so then the pharmaceutical companies aren't really actually doing much research then, because they know that it's not going to be worth it for them in the end. Anyway, okay, so one other example here, government-created barriers. I mean, there's just random examples, right, that you could probably think of. But another one I was thinking about was in provincial parks. So in most provincial parks, you're not allowed to open a business. You can't build a store or a hotel or something. But there are a few parks that already have businesses, right? So say Manning Park. Manning Park has a hotel, and they have a restaurant, and they have a ski area, so you can go there in the winter or go camping in the summertime. But they're a monopoly, right? It's just the one business that has the hotel and the restaurant, and they're a monopoly. Nobody else is allowed to start a business in the park. Or there's another one further east. It's called Cathedral Lakes Provincial Park. It's a small one, and it's not very well known because there's one hotel that has a monopoly. They're the only one in the park. They existed first. The hotel was there first, like 100 years ago. And then the province built or established a provincial park around the hotel. But they not only have a monopoly over the hotel, they have a monopoly on the road to the hotel. So if you want to go to this provincial park, you either have to hike in, which is like a 7 or 8 hour hike, or they have a shuttle service. And of course, they have a monopoly over the shuttle service. And so you have to pay like $100 to get a ride up this very rough dirt road. Okay, so that's another example anyway, where the government, for good reason, prevents other businesses from being established in the parks.